Hello, everyone. I hope you are all fine during this continuing lockdown and health crisis. Hopefully, it will soon be over. Um, for the moment, I'm going to give you the lecture on conduct of hostilities. This is part of my IHL class at the University of Bern. As you know, you have at your disposal all the different material for the course. I hope you did your readings for today, and if not, please do so while after looking at this course. It's quite important that you have a good understanding of today's lecture because it's part of the core of what is the law of armed conflict. Today, we are indeed going to look at the very basic principles of the conduct of hostilities, what we call conduct of hostilities, which is part of the broader, let's say, area of means and methods of warfare. So the first general idea that you need to understand is that the object or the fundamental principle of contemporary IHL or contemporary law regulating armed conflict is not to conduct a total war, not to eradicate, for example, the enemy, to kill everyone, to destroy everything. Rather, the St. Petersburg Declaration of 1868 established that the role of the armed forces in armed conflict is to defeat the military forces of the enemy, just to defeat, and to take the appropriate means and methods of warfare to defeat the enemy. In terms of terminology, when we talk about means and methods of warfare, by means we talk about weapons, which are the tools that enable a party to an armed conflict to conduct a war. We are going to have a course on means of warfare and on weapons law later in May. So today we are going to concentrate on methods of warfare, which are the rules regulating targeting and military objectives, the rules on the principle of distinction, precaution, proportionality in attacks, and the different norms that apply to these principles. So the sources are, the classic sources of international humanitarian law, which are the Hague Law on the one hand, but customary international law, it's quite important as well, basically because, as we have seen already in the past courses, customary international law applies at least for the issue of methods of warfare to international armed conflicts and to non-international armed conflicts. And this is very important because there are very limited rules on methods of warfare applicable or applying. If you want, I have to rephrase this. There are very little rules on methods of warfare in non-international armed conflicts in treaty law. In other words, there are a few rules in Additional Protocol 2, there are a few rules in certain other treaties, but basically where you can find the norms applying to non-international armed conflicts, that is, by extension, to armed non-state actors, are in customary international law. And this is very, very important because it means that, in fact, armed groups, like states, are bound by the rules that we are going to look into now. So the first and basic rule that you need to understand is the one that can be found in Article 35 of Additional Protocol 1, which says that in any armed conflict, the right of the parties to the conflict to choose methods or means of warfare is not unlimited. And this also stems from this idea that we just looked at from the Declaration of St. Petersburg, to say that, in fact, today parties to an armed conflict uh, cannot do whatever it takes to win the war, or to whatever, it cannot either kill everyone, or it cannot employ means and methods that would be illegal, such as torturing, such as using certain weapons, such as not respecting certain principles. So this is why the rules pertaining to the means and methods of warfare are really at the core of contemporary IHL, and express this principle that there is limitation, there are limitations imposed by the law on how a party to an armed conflict can conduct the war. The basic principles and rules relating to the methods of warfare are the principles of distinction, precaution, proportionality, and the general principle that parties to an armed conflict must strike a balance between military necessity and humanitarian interests. And this is again at the core of what is IHL, what is international humanitarian law. It's a balance between the need of a state or non-state armed group to actually be able to win a conflict, and the necessity to respect certain limitations for the benefit of the civilian population and those who have ceased to participate in hostilities. And this equilibrium is really at the core of IHL, and this is what also the principles that we are going to look into try to address. So first, the principle of distinction, which is of course part of customary international law and has been and is codified in Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1, which was also a principle which was existing before the protocols, in a sense which establishes that in order to ensure respect for and protection of the civilian population and civilian object, which is the purpose of IHL, the parties to the conflict shall, so this is a very clear obligation, at all times, means that there is no derogation possible, distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall, again, hard obligation, direct their operations only against military objectives. So read this provision several times in order to understand the core strength of this obligation, which is really one of the basic IHL obligation, which violation can be considered as a war crime. So, in a nutshell, the principle of distinction oblige parties to an armed conflict to target only military objectives and to spare the civilian population and civilian objects, to distinguish at all times between those two. And of course, the first question which will arise from this is, first of all, what are civilians, and what are civilian objects, and what are military objectives? Before looking into this definition, it is also important to understand what is an attack. If parties to an armed conflict have the obligation to distinguish between civilian objects, civilians, and military objectives, one needs to understand at what time and in which circumstances they are obliged to do so. So an attack is defined in Article 49 of the first protocol, and it means acts of violence against the adversary, whether in offense or in defense. And this is very important because there is a tendency to believe that the principle of distinction only applies when a party to an armed conflict decides to attack the adversary in offense. But in fact, it's not so. And at all times, including in defense, parties must distinguish between um, military objectives and the civilian population. The paragraph 2 of this provision also says that the provisions of this protocol with respect to attacks apply to all attacks in whatever territory conducted, including the national territory belonging to a party to the conflict but under the control of an adverse party. And you remember in the first courses that we held when there was still no lockdown at the university, we talked about the geographical scope of application of IHL, and we determined that IHL is applicable also, for example, to the high seas or to a territory which is under the occupation to another territory, and there are also possibility of hostilities spilling over different frontiers. So this principle applies to all attacks in whatever territory conducted as specified in this article. So the principle of distinction is embodied in fact, this prohibition of a party to conduct indiscriminate attacks. So what does it mean if we break down the principle of distinction? It means that indiscriminate attacks are prohibited when they are not directed at a specific military objective. So in order to be lawful, an attack must be specifically directed at a military objective. It also means that an attack will be contrary to the principle of distinction when the party employs methods or means which cannot be directed at a specific military objective. For example, the use of a certain weapon, which in of itself cannot, for technical reasons, be able to distinguish between a military objective and a civilian population or civilian object. Because, for example, the use of a missile, for example, would be of a too far range to be able to actually distinguish between the two. And it also means that it is illegal to employ methods or means of combat, the effect of which cannot be limited. So if you use a certain weapon which spreads a toxic gas, let's say, and this gas it is impossible to actually constrain the gas to only military objectives, then it means that this is also prohibited. You also need to read this rule as in terms of a consequential narrative, in the sense that you cannot employ either certain tactics or certain means of warfare which are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilian object without discrimination. So this is, in a nutshell, what the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks mean. And this you will find in Additional Protocol 1, but also in customary international humanitarian law. You will also find that there are specific persons or objects which are protected in particular. And we will look at this more specifically when we have the lecture on the protection of the medical mission. But medical units are indeed specifically protected, so it is prohibited to attack a medical unit, even if it's, attached to enemy forces. There is the possibility to notify the enemy of the location of the unit, but it is also the obligation of the party to the armed conflict not to locate this medical unit near a military objective. And there is an exception, but we'll look at this a bit more in details, but I just wanted already to highlight this point, is that if the medical unit, for example, an ambulance or a hospital, is used to store weapons or to shield combatants, then it may be attacked by the enemy forces, but first a warning must be issued, in the sense that the party to the armed conflict must warn the medical unit, for example, in order to evacuate, for instance, the hospital preceding an attack, if if this hospital is believed to shield, for example, enemy combatants. The same rules can apply to medical transports, which can be, medical vehicles, ships, or aircraft, which cannot be attacked. There is a possibility to stop and search these vessels, for example, at sea, and to verify status. And there are different rules for medical aircraft in controlled areas, contact zones, but I will not go into details about this. You can look in articles 21, 22, and 23 of Protocol Additional 1 if you wish to do so. So the first question that one might ask when examining the principle of distinction is, what are military objectives? How can we know that a person, for example, here we see Libyan rebels during the clashes with army forces in the Libya war in 2011, are these persons military objectives or not? The question revolves around what is a civilian and what is a combatant, and we are going to look into this much more in detail, because I've decided to indeed give you a course on detention and on who are those persons member that are considered to be member of an armed group or participating in hostilities. But to tell you that the whole idea that military commanders must abide by is indeed to take all the efforts to identify what is a military objective or not. So the first way to identify what is a military objective is by applying a negative reasoning, by saying those are all those who are not combatant and who are civilian object, for example. So who are the non-combatants? Well, obviously the civilians, as long as they do not participate in hostilities, but also the military medical personnel and the military chaplains. Those are considered to be non-combatants. and are protected by the Geneva Conventions. There are also specific protection of the people who are hors de combat. Those are the sick, wounded, and shipwrecked. Those are the persons who are surrendering, or those are, for example, the persons that are parachuting from a disabled aircraft. All those persons may not be targeted. So they are not military objectives, and they are absolutely protected from being targeted and being killed, if you want, because they are not considered as military objectives. These rules are part, again, of customary international law and from treaty law, and also, for example, in Common Article 3 with regards to the sick, wounded, and shipwrecked, those who are also hors de combat and who are surrendering. So what are the lawful targets? And this, you can have a look at Article 52 of Additional Protocol 1. And this article will tell you that all combatants and objects which, by their nature, location, purpose, or use, make an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definite military advantage. This again you can find in Article 52 and Rule 8 of the ICRC customary study. We need to pause here for a minute because, as you may see, it's quite a complicated rule. It means that, in fact, there is not a list that you can find in the Geneva Conventions of what are military or military objectives or lawful targets. But you will need to understand this by an interpretation. So the nature of what is a lawful target will be interpreted in relation to what this object or person which use or purposes can make to make an effective contribution to military action. So whenever a party to an armed conflict will decide, for example, to target a specific objective, obviously it will decide whether the destruction of this object or combatant offers a definite military advantage. Of course, you need to keep in mind that civilians are considered to be, in essence, not a lawful target at all. And all those that we have also looked at, the medical personnel and civilian objects, are not targetable. But you may find an object which can, in nature, contribute to military action, can be used, for example, for military purposes, and in that case, it can be considered to provide the destruction of this particular object can offer a definite military advantage, and it can be targeted. So, by interpretation, we can consider that, of course, the member of the armed forces of the enemy are military objectives. So are the military vehicles, notably the military aircraft and warships, buildings and objects for combat service support, the manufacturers of weapons, military bases, all those objects which will support combat operation. And all the commercial entities which make an effective contribution to military action, transport facilities, such as trains, industrial plants, when they are used to support the enemy, can of course be considered to be military objectives and can be targetable by a party to an armed conflict without, for example, this targeting being considered to be a violation of the principle of distinction. One could wonder about certain means and methods of warfare which could be considered or not as a military objective. Propaganda, for example, or all these objects or entities which actually diffuse propaganda, radio station, um, or other type of television set, or that kind of, or even the internet. What could wonder? Um, so is a broadcasting station a military objective? Well, then one need again here to make an interpretation. If the nature, the location, and the purpose or the use makes an effective contribution to the enemy's military action, then indeed it can be considered to be a military objective. So there is also a prohibition to conduct attacks on what is called dangerous forces, and this prohibition you can find in Article 56 of AP1, which prohibits the attack of dams, dikes, or nuclear electrical generating stations, which may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. And this includes also all the nearby facilities. The IHL also contains prohibition to attack certain cultural property, which protects movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. So there is the UNESCO list, for example. Buildings whose main purpose is to preserve or exhibit the movable cultural property, so museum, and centers containing a large amount of cultural property. So all these are specifically protected under IHL. I will not go into the details. You can find a lot of literature on this particular issue, which has been drafted by excellent scholars. And in particular, there is a study conducted by Geneva Call on the protection of cultural property and armed non-state actors. So I encourage you to look at these issues separately. If you want to have more reference, do not hesitate to ask me, and I will send them to you. Let us look now at the second principle, which is the principle of precaution. So we have looked at the principle of distinction. Now the principle of precaution that you can find in Article 57 of the first protocol. So it says that in the conduct of military operations, constant care shall be taken to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. And it needs, in doing so, first of all, to remove civilians from the vicinity of military objective, to avoid locating military objectives in densely populated areas, and to take other necessary precautions. So the principle of precaution is, of course, linked to the principle of distinction. It requires parties to an armed conflict to actually ensure that by taking certain measures that the civilian population will be spared at the maximum from the hostilities. So to warn civilians that an attack is going to take place, to for example, look into the specific time where there is a lot of civilians in a specific area where you have a military objective nearby. For example, if you have, let's say, a member of an armed group which lives in a certain area, there is an obligation to see when an attack can be the less harmful possible. So you can look at the different time of an attack which would be appropriate. There is also the obligation to identify the target and to verify that this target is indeed a military objective and not a civilian object or a civilian person. So there is an obligation from the party to an armed conflict to do everything feasible to verify that the objectives attacked are military objectives and are neither civilians nor civilian objects, to avoid excessive collateral damage or incidental injury, to warn if circumstances permit. So we are going to look at this. And this obligation is based on the information which is reasonably available to the commander at time of the decision was made. So there is not obligation to constantly evaluate the nature of the object or the person to be sure that it's a military objective. But at the time where the decision was made, there is an obligation to take all the information which is available on which the commander is able to verify whether it is a military objective. And the third principle I wanted to examine with you is the principle of proportionality. So to be clear, all these principles are linked, right? They are just an embodiment of this idea that a party to an armed conflict must distinguish between civilian and civilian object and military objective. So the principle of proportionality says that it may the party of an armed conflict may not cause suffering, injury, or destruction to non-combatants or civilian objects, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So again, it's quite complicated. The proportionality assessment is not linked, for example, to the number of civilian deaths or to the amount of destruction of, let's say, of a certain property, but really is an endeavor to equilibrate the damage that a military attack will inevitably do with the military advantage, and it must be concrete and direct military advantage that a party can draw from this specific attack. So this is a subjective notion, and by essence, it's indeed, whenever it's subjective, it can be criticized, but it is what is required by law, and there has been effort to actually clarify what proportionality means. I encourage you again here to read one of the latest study of the ICRC on the principle of proportionality, where you will have a bit more information about this rule. The principle of necessity, of military necessity, will be a judgment call by the commander to actually take certain measures which are required to overpower the enemy. It's not so much a legal issue because it's about taking measures which are not forbidden by IHL, but which are indeed required to overpower the enemy, and it will be a balance test to do by the military commander. So before an attack, you will have an operational planning process that will take place, where usually there will be an analysis made by different commanders. There will be different actors also playing a role in this operational planning processes. For example, the intelligence services, which will give information on the nature of the proposed target. There will be also an assessment: where are the population centers, where are military objectives. There will be a list of the priority targets. There will be issues about, as we said, the verification and identification of the target, the type of the target, and the available weapon systems to actually strike the target. It is also required to use a weapon which is not indiscriminate, for example. There will be rules of engagement, restrictions and prohibition that will also be decided. The evaluation in relation to the collateral damage, so linked to the principle of proportionality. The importance of the target versus the nature of civilian object. So the balance again of the collateral damage considerations, and also the risk to a party to an armed conflict owned troop will be taken in consideration in this operational planning process. So as you can see, there are the core principles of distinction, precaution, proportionality, and also issues linked to military necessities that will play a role in how a party conducts an armed conflict. So this relates to what we call methods of warfare, and it is a bit abstract. I can understand this. So I would like you to look at two case studies. We will not look at this together, although I'm wondering if we can or not. So yes, let us watch at those two case studies, and then you can look for them again. The first is linked to the Maria shelter attack in 1991 during the first Gulf War, where we will see a shelter which hosted civilians was attacked, and there is this big debate whether this was an intentional attack or not. And then I would like us to look at the issue on the Gaza conflict of 2014 and the platform put in place by Amnesty International, which also explains what can be the different measures that a party to an armed conflict can take. And of course, we have contemporary challenges that will be very heavy on the principles of means and methods of warfare. I mean, rather methods of warfare. For example, the fact that an armed conflict takes place within a urban center. So urban conflicts taking place in highly dense areas, highly populated area, is a big challenge to conduct of hostilities, because indeed it will put a strain to the principle of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. So let's see if we can look at this video first, and then we can be able, and then we'll talk about this.
Officials insist was a military bunker.
Putting this at the beginning.
Iraqi civilians killed in an American bombing raid on what U.S. officials insist was a military bunker.
It was a legitimate target, and it was struck.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, America at war.
Good evening. The Iraqis claim it was a civilian air raid shelter. American military officials say they have evidence it was an important Iraqi military bunker. Whatever it was, a lot of Iraqi civilians are dead tonight as a result of the bombing attack on the facility in a residential area of western Baghdad. We begin with news of the attack. Jeremy Bowen of the BBC reports now for NBC News.
This evening, according to rescue workers, hundreds of bodies still lie in the shelter. They say that more than 200 have been recovered. A large crowd had gathered by the time we were taken there this morning. Everyone I spoke to told the same story. They said that the shelter was used by women, children, and old men. Some bystanders said more than 1,000 of them had gone in the night before. The crowd outside seemed deeply shocked by what had happened. People told us that the British and the Americans were savages, animals, and criminals. This man said that 11 of his family were in the shelter. Another asked if this was the way to fight for Kuwait. Outside the entrance, about 8 corpses had been loaded onto a lorry. Men who said they'd left their families there the night before waited.
I don't know why do they hit children and already why I lose my wife and my children. It's not fair. Nobody says something. Somebody must come. They should not. I can't say anything more.
We went inside. Civil defense workers were trying to force themselves in through the heat and smoke. Some of them brought out a body. They were already exhausted, and their job, taking out bodies and searching desperately for survivors, had scarcely started. On the roof, there was a large hole where the projectile had smashed into the building. The bomb or missile went through a reinforced concrete roof at least a yard thick. The Iraqis say the attack happened at about 4 o'clock this morning. It's the worst damage by far that they've taken us to see, but they say there have been more serious attacks on civilian areas. The head of Baghdad's Civil Defense Force said there were no military targets in the area. We were taken to a hospital. About 30 bodies had been laid out in the yard. Most were burnt beyond recognition. A doctor was there.
This is the most vicious and cruel attack that I've ever witnessed. And I only hope that those who are responsible for this can be forgiven by God.
There are very few survivors. One doctor said 8. Another said he wasn't expecting to admit many more. Among them, a girl whose mother and 2 brothers were trapped, and a 5-year-old boy whose mother and 2 sisters hadn't been found. There were dreadful scenes outside the hospital. None of this was set up for our cameras. It was real grief and real anger. Jeremy Bowen for NBC News, Baghdad.
Although Bowen said he saw no evidence that it was a military facility, at the Pentagon, a different point of view tonight. NBC's Fred Francis is there with the American military explanation of what happened and why. Fred?
Tom, Pentagon officials claim they have intercepted detailed military conversations from the Baghdad bunker to commanders in Kuwait, and they have detailed pictures which prove the building was used by senior officers. But this is what the Pentagon released to defend its targeting, a drawing which shows the so-called Iraqi communications bunker on the southwest edge of the city, surrounded by civilian homes, a school, and a mosque.
Saddam Hussein, who lives in this city, has seen the results of a very strategic and surgical bombing campaign directed against that military infrastructure. He had to know that we knew that this was a military facility. And why he would put innocent civilians in this facility troubles me greatly, and is something that, quite frankly, just mystifies us.
Because of the civilian neighborhood, one stealth fighter dropped 2 laser-guided 2,000-pound bombs at 4:30 in the morning. The building had been covered with 15 feet of steel-reinforced concrete. It had a camouflage roof, and its radios, deep in the basement, were protected from the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, of a nuclear blast.
You don't EMP harden a bomb shelter ever. It's a very expensive thing to do. We do that with a lot of the communications that we have, and it costs a whole lot of money, and the only possible reason on earth to EMP harden something is to protect military communications.
The first bomb punched a hole in the roof. The second followed to explode deep inside. Military officials who watched and listened to the building by satellite for 5 days say now they believe the civilians were moved in at night.
Well, from a military point of view, nothing went wrong. From a personal point of view, I'm outraged that civilians might have been placed in harm's way. And I blame the Iraqi government and the Iraqi leadership for that.
Tom, military leaders say they will not change their strategy. Even if Iraqi civilians are used as shields, they say they will bomb any facility from which Iraqi leaders talk to troops in Kuwait. Tom?
But Francis, if they did intercept radio messages from that bunker, what did they learn from them?
Well, after the battle for Khafji, they overheard commanders from that bunker talking to commanders in southern Kuwait, telling them to...
Okay, so this is an illustration, I believe, of what can be the process of determining what is a military objective and civilian and civilian population. Here it was the issue of having a shelter where civilians were sleeping at night in Baghdad. So the strike was taking place first within a city, and the whole issue was whether or not the military commander, the U.S. military commander, knew that civilians were there at night, because according to them, as you listened to the video, it was rather a military compound where military telecommunication was taking place, and this is why they thought it was a military objective, and this compound was observed for a whole week in order indeed to establish that this was, well, a military objective and not a place where civilians were taking shelter. The issue here shows the complexity, first, of establishing the veracity of certain targets during an armed conflict, during the midst of war. It also shows that what is required in order to be responsible for war crime is an intentional targeting of civilians. So here, it wouldn't be considered as a war crime in the sense that the U.S. military did not intend to target civilian population, but rather thought it was a military object. So then it's whenever this, or if it ever goes into a military court, or even an international criminal court or a national criminal court, this would need to be proven indeed that the party to the armed conflict that struck, for example, here this shelter, took all the precaution, tried to establish the military nature of this objective, and so on and so forth. The second example or case study I wanted to look at with you is linked to the Gaza conflict of 2014. It's a bit old, but it's also interesting to see the different the different measures that were taken by a state in this conflict. Bear also in mind what we have talked about the principle of distinction, precaution, and proportionality in attack, which will be discussed in this short video. And also I would like to discuss with you the principle of precaution as well. So let's see if it works. Yes, it does.
denied every single civilian casualty. And the truth is this: Israel was doing everything to minimize Palestinian civilian casualties.
You can see two very distinct peaks in the violence that Israel was afflicted on the Gaza Strip.
There's evidence of deliberate targeting of civilians, of disproportionate attacks against civilians, often in their homes.
And each one of them comes at the wake of a suspicion or, in fact, a capture of an Israeli soldier by Hamas. At that moment, all hell breaks loose.
Indiscriminate attacks, such as with the use of artillery fire in densely populated civilian areas.
Attacks on first responders, attacks on ambulances, on hospitals.
And wanton destruction of civilian buildings, of civilian infrastructure. All of those are war crimes.
Receiving these figures all in one go, 500 children were killed. It is, of course, extremely disturbing already. But starting to see it in relation to each specific event in many different strikes over the entire conflict is something that is always very disturbing for me, even after working on this platform for more than a year. One of the first things we've been looking at when exploring the Gaza platform was the highly deadly strikes during the Gaza conflict. And the numbers are quite impressive. There were at least 27 strikes that resulted in at least 10 or more casualties.
The Israeli military used artillery fire in densely populated residential areas.
An artillery shell cannot be specifically targeted, and it will never be more specific than 50 meters one way or the other, but at least the size of a football pitch. Now that is an area weapon. Now when that is used in any urban environment, how can one be sure there are no civilians or non-combatants in that area?
And it completely flouts what is a fundamental principle of the laws of war, which is the principle of distinction, distinguishing between fighters and civilians. You don't use a weapon such as artillery in a situation where you can't distinguish.
Amnesty International investigated a number of cases where a large number of people from the same family have died in this home. So in one case, for example, the Abu Jamia family in Khan Yunis, there were 24 members of the family in the home. And as they were preparing to break their fast during the month of Ramadan, one fighter who was fleeing an area of fighting had come and hid underneath a balcony outside of the home. Now Israel bombed the house and killing 24 people in it. That attack is clearly disproportionate. In most cases, the strikes that we have do not mention any military targets. Moreover, if we're talking about 1,100 different strikes on different houses, could they all be legitimate military targets? It doesn't seem likely.
the Israeli military dropped leaflets on areas saying, we're going to attack this area, get out.
Sometimes they announce it with microphones. They can even enter into the telephone system. You can get an SMS or a phone call.
אתה מדבר עברית? מצוין. מה שמך? מה שלומך? הכל בסדר? צבא ישראלי כרגע, אנחנו צריכים להפציץ את הבית.
The problem was that they gave no advice on where those civilians should flee to. They gave no safe route out of that area. So a completely ineffective warning.
If I am sitting in a home and I get this, what they call a knock on the roof, it is not necessarily a clear sign of a warning. I may think it's an attack. I may choose to sit at home and hide under the bed. Shooting a rocket at a people's house can and did endanger people's lives. It can kill, it can injure.
These are not effective. Families did not know that they were being warned. Sometimes they didn't even have enough time to evacuate the building, and they died while in the process of leaving that building. If you stay in your house despite a warning missile, Israeli lawyers would consider you as a voluntary human shield. The Israeli military interpretation of people who are not evicting their house after warning is that they are participating in warfare, therefore losing their legal protection as civilians.
The Gaza platform also reveals the widespread use of tank shells in areas where civilians were living. In other cases, they'd fled there from other areas that had been bombed and attacked by the Israeli military during the conflict.
These medics have been attacked. Ambulances have been bombed, and the medics coming out of ambulances to kind of attend to people have been shot at. In one case, one medic was shot at by an Israeli soldier in the leg, and he was left there to bleed until he died. Medics should be not only protected, but also their work should be facilitated. And what we've seen here is that Israel has worked completely against that. This is a war crime, just pure and simple.
Both the scale of these attacks and in many cases the fact that there was no apparent military target either inside or in the proximity of those buildings throws up a really striking question about the extent to which the Israeli military were committing wanton destruction.
So attack on infrastructure are seen very much as collective punishment of an entire population.
What we're calling on the international community, obviously key governments in that to do, is to support the work of the International Criminal Court to ensure that at the end of the day, as has never happened to date, there is justice for those who've lost loved ones in the last conflict.
So here, I thought it was also an interesting example of not so much the content, of course, of the investigation of Amnesty International, which is very interesting, and on this particular conflict, because there are many other conflicts where this actually also takes place. And more recently, you have conflicts taking place in densely populated area in Libya, in Yemen, and other places like this. But this is a challenge where you can also examine certain of the issues. Certain of the issues that we have looked in the course are illustrated, such as how can a legitimate military target can be verified and established. The issue of warning I thought was very interesting, and the knock on the roof issue, where you have first a strike, and then I don't know if you saw that it takes 1 minute after, just 1 minute for the person to realize that it needs to evacuate the home. So is this a sufficient time to allow someone to leave the house? What about elderly people? What about persons with disabilities that cannot necessarily hear this famous knock on the roof? So issues about the principle of precaution to protect the civilian population. And at the end also, at the end and at the beginning, sorry, we also saw the issue of the use of certain artillery weapons and artillery shells that cannot really in itself be able to distinguish between military objectives and civilian, especially when these are used in densely populated area. So this was a course on this core principles pertaining to methods of warfare. It's a complicated matter. I don't say it's not. So please have a look at the different readings that are on your reading list to have a better understanding of these principles, which are really key in international law. The fact that they are difficult principles to implement, and because there is also a certain margin of appreciation, you'll find that in the case law, these will also be difficult it will also be difficult for the judges to establish when war crimes were committed in relation to conduct of hostilities. So this is it for today. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have certain questions on this lecture. We will have another lecture next week according to our program. And until then, well, take care and have a nice week. Bye.